There are many approaches to the study of sexuality, and human sexuality can be studied by many of these different modes of inquiry. And the reason is that it affects so many different aspects of our lives. Uh, People who work in these different disciplines make different assumptions about the purpose, mechanisms, and development of sexual feelings and behaviors, and they ask different questions and employ different methods to answer those questions. In recent years, as you can see from this slide, the study of human sexuality has accelerated. And this reflects both the increasing acceptance of sex and sexuality as a topic of discourse by society, but it's also spurred by increasing awareness of the social and economic problems that are related to sex, like the AIDS epidemic, teen pregnancy, and divorce. If you look at the slide, you can see the enormous increase in sexuality-based research as compared to both research on antibiotics and research on financial matters. In both cases, you can see a steady rise from 1977 to 2007 in sexuality research. Now, there are a number of ways to approach the study of sexuality, and I'll go through a couple of them. The first is biomedical research. It focuses on the underlying mechanisms of sex, and over time, medical science has gathered information about the physical basis of sexuality, in particular the structure, function, and development of the bodily systems related to the reproductive system. Starting at the time of the Renaissance, anatomists made detailed studies of the internal reproductive tracts of men and women. And here you see a picture by Leonardo da Vinci of coitus between a man and a woman, and here you actually see the insertion of the male penis into the female vagina. Interestingly, later on we'll see a similar picture that was obtained by NMR spectroscopy of the same thing, but this time actually happening in that device. Now, as you can see from the note above, biomedical approaches to the study of sex involve anatomists, endocrinologists, reproductive physiologists, neuroscientists, geneticists, pathologists, and microbiologists. So lots and lots of different scientists are interested and have studied human reproduction. Now, in the 20th century, endocrinologists and reproductive physiologists explored the hormonal systems that make men's and women's bodies so different from each other. These systems give women something men don't have, a menstrual cycle and a capacity to nurture a fetus. And because the menstrual cycle was so noticeable, people tended to focus on this to figure out what was going on. Neuroscientists have looked at the neural control mechanisms that mediate sexual arousal and sexual behavior. Geneticists have looked at how sex is determined and how the process of sex determination can go awry. And pathologists and microbiologists have discovered the causes of sexually transmitted diseases. There has also been physiological observation of sexual responses, and these have been valuable, especially the contributions of William Masters and his wife, his collaborator, and later his wife, Virginia Johnson. Masters was born in 1915 and passed away in 2001, and his wife was born in 1925 and still is with us. This is a picture of them. They worked at Washington University School of Medicine starting in the late 1950s, and they recruited volunteers to engage in sexual behavior, either solitary or partnered, in their lab. They studied their volunteers' sexual responses through visual observation and also by means of recording instruments with which they recorded blood pressure, respiration rate, and other physiological measurements. They also specifically designed instruments that recorded penile erection, vaginal engorgement, and sphincter contractions and other genetic processes. And here you see two devices that they used. The one on the left is called a vaginal plethysmograph, and that was used to measure what was happening in the vagina during sexual arousal. And they also used the device on the right, which is a penile strain gauge, to measure the amount of penile erection, and to get an idea of that through an idea of human sexual arousal on the male end of it through that device. In 1966, Masters and Johnson published Human Sexual Response, which was the first comprehensive description of how men's and women's bodies perform during sexual behavior. And it probably isn't necessary to say it was a bestseller, but it was a bestseller for almost 2 years. And I started working in a bookstore in 1966 when this was on the shelves, and for my first 2 years of working there, it was a bestseller. Having the book myself and having looked at it, I would guess that most of the people who bought the book might have looked at the first 3 pages and then stopped reading it and left it on their bookshelf, because it is highly technical. Now, Masters and Johnson faced vocal criticism from people, both professional and non-professional, who considered their work prurient, figured it was arousing unwholesome sexual interest. And these people also felt that it focused too much interest on the mechanics of sex at the expense of love and relationships. Masters and Johnson studied healthy men and women, but they also studied those who suffered from a variety of sexual problems, and they developed techniques for helping such people improve their sexual lives. And these techniques were described in their 1970 book, Human Sexual Inadequacy. Other individuals studied the body's chemical messengers. They looked at the endocrinology and neuropharmacology of human sexual response, and these studies have had a great impact on sexuality. In the mid-1900s, the mid-20th century, sex hormones were discovered, and this has led to a number of discoveries. For example, oral contraceptives, in vitro fertilization, drug treatments for breast and prostate cancer, treatments to increase or decrease the sex drive, and treatments to ease sexual dysfunctions that are associated with menopause. Also, there was the identification of neurotransmitters that has led to treatments for compulsive sexual behaviors and other aspects of neuropharmacology. There also has been a discovery about the chemical mechanisms by which penile erection occurs, and this led to, in 1999, to the introduction of sildenafil, better known as Viagra, for erectile dysfunction treatment in men. And this was followed by other drugs in the same class, and if you watch TV late at night, you'll probably see an ad for each and every one of them. They are responsible for having improved the sex lives of millions of men and their partners, and for good or ill, they're redefining normal sexual performance in men as they age. Interestingly, Viagra was first looked at not for erectile dysfunction, but for treatment of blood pressure. And it was discovered that while it did work to some extent for blood pressure, it had a specific effect on the erectile machinery of the penis, and it has been, while it was approved for use as a blood pressure med, as often happens with medicines, a side effect for which it was not approved became erectile dysfunction, and it didn't require any further approval because it had already been approved. Now here's a picture of Viagra, and in addition, serotonin and other neurotransmitters were identified in the central nervous system that led to the introduction of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are the Prozac-like drugs. And they are used for the treatment of compulsive sexual desires and behaviors, things like exhibitionism and voyeurism. Those drugs may also impair the sexual performance of people who take them for depression. Um, There also have been identification of the hormones that regulate the secretions of the pituitary glands, and that led to drugs for the treatment of precocious and delayed puberty. And there's also been the identification of the signaling mechanisms that regulate childbirth, and this led to the drugs that are used for the induction of labor and for the prevention of premature labor. All of the advances that I mentioned above were made possible by research in lab animals. Also, researchers study the sexual behavior of animals both in the lab and in the wild, and they've observed an extraordinary diversity of sexual behavior and sexual relationships. They've seen animals that change their sexes, animals that are both sexes at once, or in some cases neither. They've seen animals that mate in pairs or in crowds, animals that are heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, and animals that mate to reproduce, and those that do so for other purposes, including for the simple pleasure of it. There's no standard form of sexuality in the animal kingdom to which humans need to conform. Rather, each species' sexuality is the product of its own evolutionary history, and that includes humans.